Before the 1977 and 78 Riviera was introduced, the Riviera nameplate really denoted a special Buick with quite a bit of romance. The Riviera name dated all the way back to 1949 when it was used on a variant of the Roadmaster, a two-door hardtop coupe that displayed some relatively novel styling, particularly the hardtop styling, for the era. Then in 1963, the Buick Riviera went in a personal luxury coupe direction and was meant to evoke a cross between the Ferraris of the era as well as Rolls-Royces, and it was highly successful. Then, following the 1963 to 65 Riviera, there was the second generation Riviera, which ran from 1966 to 1970, which was equally beautiful as the previous generation, perhaps even a little bit more so. And this one also sold very well. Then in 1971, there was the introduction of the boat tail Riviera. And unlike the 1966 to 1967 Riviera, which was a sales success, selling typically around 40,000 units a year or more, the boat tail Riviera, which lasted from 1971 to 1973, would certainly not achieve such sales success. In fact, the average sales of Rivieras from 1971 to 73 were cut roughly in half versus the previous generation. It was in this particular context that a number of things happened to the Riviera. The first was that in 1974, the Riviera got de-boat-tailed and had a more conventional rear end that was based on a Cadillac design proposal that Chief Designer Wayne Cady was told by General Motors Vice President Bill Mitchell to graft onto the existing Riviera to de-boat-tail it. At least the Riviera got some high-mounted stop lamps that were somewhat novel, although the Oldsmobile Tornado had introduced those in 1971. And even before that, I believe in 1970, the Ford Thunderbird had optional high-mounted stop lamps. So it wasn't totally novel, but something that you didn't see on many cars of the era. Now, that 1974 to 76 Riviera was a bit of a reaction to the boat tail from 71 to 73, but the 1977 to 78 Riviera was even more of a reaction to the boat tail. And what do I mean by that? Well, remember that I said the 1971 to 73 Riviera just really wasn't a great seller. And as a consequence, the Buick division managers and sales teams really were loath to accept another design from GM design staff that was so controversial as the boat tail. Instead, they pushed the GM designers to go in a much more conventional direction, the result of which was the, let's call it bland and insipid, 1977 to 78 Riviera that you see here. Now, for the 1977 model year, General Motors downsized all of its full-size cars quite significantly, and the Riviera was no exception. The Riviera's wheelbase moved from 122 inches in 1976 to just a little under 116 inches in 1977. The car shed a commensurate amount of weight, about 600 pounds as a result. Now, the fact that the cars were downsized didn't mean that the styling had to be bland, but that was certainly dictated by Buick Division's general management, who really pressed GM's design staff to put forward a conventional Riviera. And as a result, you effectively got a warmed-over LeSabre two-door coupe when you got a 1977 or 78 Riviera. And I think it's a bit of a travesty. Let's discuss some of the styling. First of all, when it comes to the front ends of the vehicles, the Riviera is notably different from the LeSabre in that you have this very vertically oriented grille with a cap over top of it. The cap would actually be something that would seemingly return on the 1980 Seville that also had a similar cap above the grille, but that was done on the Seville to disguise that the hood was the same on the Seville as the Eldorado. The Eldorado did not have the cap. Here, the cap is just providing, I guess, some visual elegance, we'll call it. And you notice the very vertically oriented grille with these long rectangles, very different from the LeSabre with the horizontal rectangle within a rectangle grille. And also very different from the LeSabre is that the LeSabre had kind of this slanted front end where the face of the car kind of slanted back as it went toward the hood. So the Riviera did have a different look from the LeSabre up front, but still, it's just kind of average. The quad headlamps, the turn signals under the quad headlamps, a big vertically oriented grille. Nothing much to write home about. Now, as we rotate around to this front three-quarter view, we'll notice it's a pretty conventional body side. There is a bit of an undulating belt line here. Notice that the fender top kind of rises as it approaches the A-pillar. Then the belt line kind of dips downward around the window glass. And then it kind of hops back upward around that rear quarter window and as it goes rearward. So there's a little bit of some of the styling from, I would say in particular, the first and second generation Riviera that had a little bit of that Coke bottle styling where the rear of the vehicle kind of flares upward and outward around the rear wheel. This isn't Coke bottle styling, though, because while you have a bit of that window graphic that kind of spikes upward around that rear quarter glass, the rear quarter panel itself is not flaring outboard around the rear wheel. So not quite a true Coke bottle design, but at least it was evoking some of that styling from the past. Now, this car is a two-tone variant. There were some two-tone variants. Probably the most famous two-tone variant was the 1978 25th anniversary edition that came in black and silver. And that one was rather handsome, but unfortunately the car just wasn't a greatly proportioned car. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we start to rotate around it. But you'll notice the two tones here have that effect of kind of visually slimming the body. That cream color up top and bottom is something that kind of hides that sheet metal a little bit to your eyes, and then you see that darker brown color. And that was a technique that was employed on quite a few cars of the era just to give them that similar visual slimming look. Now, as we rotate around to the side view, you can kind of see what I mean about the proportions just looking a little bit off on this car. There's a tremendous amount of rear overhang, which was not really something that was uncommon for this era. But you have, look at the space between the wheel and the wheel arch itself. There's just a ton of air gap there. It looks like this car needs much bigger wheels than it has. And of course, that was something that was true and endemic to cars of this era, but this one really just exaggerates that. It's just crying out for larger wheels. It looks like, particularly on the rear quarter panel, the wheels are far too diminutive for the size of the body. Then I'm just not a fan of that window graphic and the rear have-to-pay vinyl roof. The vinyl top workout on this just doesn't look quite right, how it kind of dips down into that cream-colored painted section as opposed to maybe staying up a little bit and continuing the belt line. It actually is below the belt line where it's going around the rear quarter glass. I just don't think that looks great. At least you do have some nicely sculpted and filleted wheel arches that are somewhat distinctive here, although notice that the rear wheel arch appears to show less prominently than the front one, which is kind of an odd look. And the rear wheel also looks smaller compared to the front wheel, but it's your eyes playing some visual trickery on you. The car does have that tapered rear, which we're going to see as we continue to rotate around it, that was so typical of GM cars during this era. Most GM cars had some form of a tapered rear. Often, in some cases, you'd see like a tapered front and tapered rear, but this one certainly has that tapered rear, similar to what the LeSabre had with that kink in the trunk. Again, we'll see as we rotate around it. And here we are out back. Now, again, not very distinctive. Buicks during this time had the wall-to-wall tail lamps quite often, and here you have these large, horizontally oriented rectangular tail lamps, but it's not quite the wall-to-wall theme that you saw on some earlier Buicks, and not my favorite, I have to say. Now, the other prominent feature from the rear of the car is this kink in the trunk, and where did that come from? Well, interestingly, one might argue that the inspiration for this was the Peugeot 504 that had a similar kind of kink in the trunk, although this one has a kink and then a crease as well, just above the taillight and on the deck lid. So a little bit different from the Peugeot, but something that you would find not only on the Riviera, but also on the LeSabre. The Electra would not have that kink in the trunk. This was just a trait that was common to the Riviera and the LeSabre, likely because they shared deck lids. And like I said, the Riviera by this point was just kind of a tarted up LeSabre, which, yeah, it is what it is. Now, the other piece that you'll notice is there's a badge that's on the rear quarter panel just above the molding. And it's kind of hard to see what that says, but I will show you now because Buick was certainly exerting bragging rights over an interesting piece of equipment on these vehicles. And here you have it, this cool logo that says four-wheel disc brakes. Now, one of the things that I have to give General Motors graphic designers credit for is they came up with a lot of cool logos during this late 70s, early 80s period. I kind of like this one. You can see you've got the disc and then the caliper denoted by the red, but four-wheel disc brakes were starting to become more common on domestic vehicles by this point. They certainly were not common overall, but they were something that you did see on upper-end cars like the Cadillac Eldorado or Imperials of the era. And truth be told, they really didn't deliver all that much better braking performance than the drums on these particular cars. I mean, these cars were just relatively heavy and the tires had relatively skinny contact patches. So the braking was kind of limited by other factors, but it did help marginally. And it was certainly something that gave the car bragging rights. And apparently Buick felt that it was enough to brag about that they put it on the quarter panel on this badge. Now, I do think that this might have been the first instance of this equipment being standard on a car in the Riviera's price class, like kind of one down from the Cadillac. I could be wrong on that. But like I said, other top-end domestic vehicles had four-wheel disc brakes. In fact, some even had standard anti-lock brakes or optional anti-lock brakes during this time or years before. I would actually say that anti-lock was something that was more popular even in the early 1970s. You get it as options on Imperials, and Lincoln even had that standard on their Mark IV. But by this point, I think that the anti-lock was kind of going out of favor. It would come back with a vengeance probably in the early 1990s, I would say. But at this point, four-wheel disc brakes was at least something to brag about. Now let's turn our gaze to the interior. And boy, is this a late 1970s interior or what? You've kind of got that powder blue. By the way, this is a different car because you wanted to find some better interior pictures. But you have a powder blue interior with lots of buttons and biscuits and crushed velour. My goodness. And you also don't have reclining seat backs. So it's definitely a late 1970s interior. But take a look. If you look at the back seat in this, you can really see the texture of the crushed velour. And oh my goodness. Also look at the door panel. Pretty complicated door panel here with the fake wood grain. This is all faux wood grain. On the top of the door panel, kind of dipping down in the middle to the casket handle door pull. And you have the big full width armrest that was common to a lot of GM cars during this time frame. So my guess is designers maybe wanted some loose cushion style seating here. This pattern looks like it almost wants to be a loose cushion style, but maybe the finance bean counters got in the way and stopped that. Regardless, a nice place to be and certainly a comfy place to sit behind the wheel. And talk about a padded horn pad. That is definitely a horn pad. The steering wheel on this has a very large horn pad in the middle of the three-spoke wheel. And as we look at the dash on this particular vehicle, there's some interesting features. Notice the top pad, first of all, and then in the center of the instrument panel top pad, there's this raised section. That's actually the lamp monitors. This car has the lamp monitors, so you can check with fiber optic lighting to see that your turn signals, headlamps, and bright lights are all working. That's what that little raised center section is there in the dash. Then you have these round silver style gauges, the speedometer on the left and the fuel gauge on the right. You'd think you'd have a tachometer or something. After all, this is a Riviera, but I guess they weren't all that sporting at this point in time. They're more luxurious. And then the clock is all the way to the right on the passenger side of the IP. Now, by this point, they didn't have the cool illuminated script, like if you got a Park Avenue in the early or mid-1980s, it would say Park Avenue. When you turn the headlamps on, that script would illuminate on the passenger side of the dash, but didn't yet have that on this particular Riviera, unfortunately. Now, under hood in this Riviera, you have Oldsmobile's 403 cubic inch V8. This would be the largest engine that you could get in General Motors passenger cars after they downsized in 1977. There were no more 455s. You could, if you got a Chevrolet truck, still get a 454, but there was no more Olds big block. The 403 is a small block Oldsmobile, and it wasn't that bad of an engine. It made 185 horsepower. The standard engine in these was a Buick 350 that made 155 horsepower. The Olds 403 is decently peppy, I have to say, in these. The one downside of the Olds 403s is just don't rev them. Keep them under 4,000 RPMs. They have hollow main bearing webs in the bottom end, so the bottom ends aren't all that strong. Again, not an issue if you just drive it normally, but if you're keeping your foot to the floor and trying to do top speed runs, you might end up having an issue. In fact, some police departments ordered vehicles with the Olds 403 engine, and they did not like them because they ended up blowing up in high-speed chases. So something to be aware about. But otherwise, a very smooth and relatively peppy engine, as I mentioned. You can tell the Olds 403 versus the Buick 350 in these. The Buick 350 has the distributor up front. The Olds has the distributor out back. The Olds also has the oil fill tube up front, whereas the Buick, you just open the valve cover. So a couple differences between these. All the GM engines during this time were painted corporate blue. GM was trying to get away from having the division tied with the engine, and that's one of the reasons why there's no label on the air cleaner. You can actually even notice here that the air cleaner has a cutout area where the Olds rocket label would originally go in prior years, and there's no label on this because, like I said, General Motors was trying to get away from division attachment to engines and really just have the engines be associated with all the relevant vehicles. And that was tough for a lot of customers. Customers, when they bought an Oldsmobile, wanted an Olds V8. They bought a Buick, they wanted a Buick V8. But by this point in time, it just didn't make sense anymore for the economies of scale that General Motors was trying to get, and they had consolidated a number of their engines. That's why, for instance, whether you got a Buick or an Olds, the Olds 403 was the top engine, for example, in these. Cadillac did still have exclusive engines during this time frame, but the other divisions were really starting to share across themselves. So what do you think of the 1977 to 78 Riviera? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.